I did let a couple more people in, so I don't know if you wanted to say anything else again.
I will drop it in the chat.
Okay. So my name is Hailey Partain. I am the county extension agent in Upson and Lamar counties. I am also the county women's president for the state of Georgia, and I do a lot with the national side, so the American National Cattle Women. My background is animal science, but meat science in particular. Um, so today I have a couple different topics we're going to cover, and if there's anything else you have questions on, feel free to interrupt me or after the fact, ask me some questions. But I'm going to share my screen. Give it a second to kick in for y'all. Okay, so I did make this presentation interactive. Brooklyn, you might have to tell me if anybody has anything in the chat. I'm going to have it open here as well, but I may not be as quick to look at it as you might be. Um, I know she did say that if you do not feel comfortable unmuting yourself and you want to put it in the chat, you feel free to do that as well. So first, we're going to talk about where does your state come from? Oh. There are four primal cuts when it comes to like a beef carcass. Does anybody know what those four are from head to tail? Yes, no, maybe? Am I talking to myself today?
They're multitasking. So let's see if anyone has any guesses. Feel free to drop them in the chat.
I'm not sure. I'm new to the beef cattle industry, so I'm not sure.
Okay, so there's four main ones. So starting at the head, we've got that shoulder area. Can anybody guess what that's called? There's a lot of roasts that you could get from the grocery store that have this name in it. Starts with the C.
Chuck.
Chuck. Yes. So chuck is the first one. That's going to be that shoulder area right behind the chuck. Do y'all know what we have next? It starts with an R.
Rib.
Rib. Then right behind the rib is where our most expensive cuts come from. It starts with an L.
Loin.
The loin. And then
I'm
our
just
final
guessing here.
one. Our final one has a couple different names that people call it. Starts with an R.
Rump.
Yes, it can be rump or round. So those are going to be our four primals. So when you look at a beef carcass, you start with your chuck, and then you go to your rib, your loin, and your round. So with cuts from all these different areas, there's a bunch of different names for different cuts. I might call one cut one thing, or Brooklyn might call it something else. If you go to the like beef it's what's for dinner or the beef check off, these are just some generic cuts that come from those different sections. Um, now they go a little bit more in depth on them. So maybe they're not just completely generic, but like your chuck roll, you've got your steaks, you've got ribs from there, you've got roasts from there. All your different areas, you can get different cuts. So these are just examples. I'm not going to go through these ones specifically because we're going to go through some other ones individually with pictures and stuff. But this is just kind of an example of there's a lot of different things you can get from these areas. So this is stuff from the chuck. One popular one that a lot of people have is like the chuck roast, but then also your flat iron steaks come from that chuck area. So those are very popular. From your rib, some popular ones from that is going to be like your rib eyes, your prime rib, your short ribs, different things like that. From your loin is going to be your tenderloins, your New York strips, your T-bones. For a T-bone, you've got like your T-bone and then you've got your porterhouse. And I'll talk to you about the difference of those here in a little bit. That's also where you get like your sirloins and different things like that. Even more so, so what covers like a portion of your loin and some of your round is like some of your culotte and your tri-tip. A portion of it is actually technically on the round because you cut that off first. From your round, you've got your sirloin tip. Like I said, a portion of it kind of bleeds over with your tri-tip, your sirloin tips, and your culottes. And then you've got your round roast. If y'all are familiar with, you might call it country fried steak. I call it chicken fried steak. So your cube steaks are primarily going to come from that round section. That's going to be like a steak that has been run through a tenderizer. A lot of like your ground beef is going to come from that round section, as well as like the chuck. Those are going to be the two ones that are going to have less steaks. If you don't decide to have roast, then you'll have more ground beef, but we'll go into that here in a little bit too. And then just your thin cuts are going to be ones that aren't necessarily on an area. They're going to be more from like that plate section, which is going to be where the diaphragm and stuff is located on the animal. And so you got like your flank steak. Back when I first started doing all this meat science stuff, flank steaks were a lot cheaper than what they are now. Now they've got to be pretty pricey. And then you've got your skirt steaks. So you've got two, you've got an inside skirt and an outside skirt. And then your brisket, which is going to be up where you got like your shoulder, and it's going to be kind of that chest area of the animal. And then your individual stew meats, chili meat, cube meat, all that kind of stuff. Some other random ones that we've got, so our miscellaneous cuts are going to be like our shanks. So like the bones, they can be used as soup bones. They can be utilized as crosscut shanks, dog bones. In your loin area, you're going to have your hanging tender, which we'll talk about that here in a little bit. Your femur and your feet can be utilized as dog bones. And then your variety, which is going to be considered like your offal, which is a lot of times stuff that gets thrown away or discarded. But that's going to be like your kidney, your heart, your liver, your tongue, oxtail, tripe. And then you've got like your brains, your sweetbreads, and the head and the hide as well. So those are all going to be kind of just products that you can get. We'll talk about in a little bit whether your processor allows for that kind of stuff or not, and if stores sell them or not. So I'm going to see what kind of knowledge we've got. So this is our identification test. I'm going to have some different cuts up here, and I want you, if you can guess what it is, if not, so it'll be the picture will pop up first, and then I'll have the title of what it is come up. Does anybody know what this is?
The best part of the cow. That's the best part of the cow.
So this is going to be our bone-in ribeye. So it's going to be our ribeye steak, bone-in. So boneless would be this bone right here would be removed, and it would just be this ribeye steak right here. So this is going to be where quality grade is determined from this area, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit too. Does anybody know what this is?
Skirt steak?
Not skirt steak. It is a strip steak, so I saw that in the chat. So this is going to be your New York strip. What about this cut? So this is going to be what we call our porterhouse steak. So with a porterhouse, you have your T-bone, which is that bone that goes right here. Y'all can see my cursor, right?
Yes.
You've got this T-bone portion right here. This side is actually going to be our New York strip. So this side of the bone is the New York strip. And then this other side is going to be our tenderloin. So when you have a T-bone, and a lot of questions people send me, and I've got this in later on in a slide too, is they might get an animal processed and they get it all into T-bones or porterhouses. But they're wondering where their New York strip and their tenderloins are at. Well, it's on either side of that bone. That is just attached there. So you kind of have to choose if you want your T-bones and your porterhouses or if you want your New York strips and your tenderloins. So we got our porterhouse, which is a T-bone, or our porterhouse is a T-bone, but a T-bone is not necessarily a porterhouse, if that makes sense. So this is our T-bone. So you call it a porterhouse. Let me go back. When it's got that big section right here of the tenderloin, when it starts to get less, is when it's just going to be considered a T-bone. So T-bone is as long as it has this T in there, but a porterhouse is the amount of meat that is on either side of that bone. Does that make sense?
So I've always had a question about T-bones versus porterhouses. And so I'm guessing that it's not just a matter that part of it's been cut off to make it a T-bone. Is it actually like where it is on the cow that there's just not as much of that tenderloin?
Yes.
Left?
So the tenderloin, and I'll actually show you a full tenderloin will be in one of these pictures that you'll see, but it kind of starts to taper off. So it's going to have a thicker area on one end, and then it's going to kind of go out and taper off. So where it starts to taper is where you have your T-bone. where it's at its fullest is going to be where the porterhouse portion is.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Anybody know what this is?
I call it a brisket.
Yes. Yes, it is a brisket. So a brisket is going to be so I used to teach meat science. I don't think I mentioned that. So before I was an extension agent, I used to teach meat science and helped run a custom slaughter facility. So I would teach this kind of stuff. When we talk about how animals accumulate fat, I used to tell it. So before I taught meat science, I taught just general animal science. And we say that where they first accumulate fat is going to be like they eat it and then it's going to drop right there. So they are first going to have all of their fat, which is going to go in that brisket area. That's why the brisket's going to be a lot more fatty than some of the other cuts. And so this brisket, as soon as they eat it, it's going to go right there into that chest area. Is that accurate? As soon as they eat it, then the fat is just going to drop right out of their mouth into their, no, but it's just an easier way for people to think, okay, fat starts accumulating at the front and then works its way back on an animal. So this is gonna be the brisket. You don't, so for cooking wise for briskets, this is gonna be like slow cooked. I mean, a lot of people do it more in like the barbecue side where they'll slow roast it, whether it's in like a smoker and a crock pot in the oven, stuff like that, because it's gonna be a lot tougher cut. All right, so this one also has that triangular shape like the brisket had. Does anybody know what this one is called? I've noticed that it is not as popular in the state of Georgia. Tri-tip, yes. So this is the tri-tip. So that is going to be down towards like the loin and round area. Tri-tip can be as a steak or it can be as a roast. This is the roast form, and then you can also do it as a steak where it would be sliced. Does anybody know what this cut is? Very expensive. Yes, your fillets or your tenderloins. So when you had that T-bone, you had your New York strip on one side, this tenderloin is going to be on the other side of the bone. What about these? Any idea? It's, yes, short ribs. See, look, you've got all of these. You just know this. You could teach this. So these are going to be your short ribs. Depending on the processor is how they're going to cut it or how you ask them to. You can have it as individual short ribs. You can kind of have it as a set of 3 or 4. But so these are going to be short ribs. Normally, you're going to put these in like a roaster, a crock pot, something like that to cook them as well. They're not going to be cooked on the grill more like a steak. So what do y'all think this cut is? This is going to be one that comes from that plate area. So it's those thin cuts. These are going to be our skirt steaks. So skirt steaks and flank steaks look similar, but they're not the same. And the way you can tell is based off of the way that the muscle runs. So you can see that the muscle is kind of running through this direction. It's going to go widthwise. For flank steaks, it's going to go lengthwise. So that's the big way that you can tell the difference because they're pretty similar if you go to the grocery store and look at them. So skirt steaks is going to be length or is going to be widthwise, where our flank steak is going to be the other direction, is the way that the muscle is going to run. Does anybody know what this cut is? You know, you've got your ribeye right here. So if you were to cut that, you would have one ribeye. This is going to be a rib roast or a ribeye roll. So this is where you get your prime rib cuts from. Usually they're going to cook this as a whole and then slice it a lot of the times. So for it to be a steak, the kind of dimensions is that they want it to be less than 2 inches. It's going to be considered a steak. If it's over 2 inches thick-wise, then it's going to be considered a roast. What about this cut? This cut is going to come from your chuck area, so up in that shoulder. Most cuts from the chuck area are going to be a little bit more tough. This one, on the other hand, is going to be very tender. Any guesses? Starts with an F. It's got 2 words to it. This is gonna be our flat iron steak. So our flat iron is gonna be very tender. It's gonna be a very hard cut to get to if you were breaking down a carcass because you've got to go through multiple different muscles to get to that. But this is gonna be our flat iron steak. So I said that for skirt steaks, your muscle is gonna run this way, but for this other one, it was gonna go the other direction. Do y'all remember what I was talking about? Flank, yes. So this is going to be our flank steak. Flank steaks, you can grill it. So like we grill it at home. We really like flank steak at my house. So how we cook it, if you just want the secret, is you score into the top of it about halfway or a little less, from a quarter to halfway. Just score it all the way through with a knife all the way down. We marinate it in Russian dressing overnight, and then we put it on the grill, and it's really good. And that way it makes it more tender because it's got that marinade that's kind of helping break it down too. Because this is going to be more of a tougher cut. If you like flank steak, that is a good way to cook it. All right, so what is this cut? Not sirloin, but it's in an area close to that. It's going to come from the round area. So this is going to be our eye of round steak. So I have done classes before in person where I have brought in cuts and coolers and had people identify them. And this is one that a lot of times it gets identified as a tenderloin. It looks very similar because it's kind of got that round shape to it, but this is actually eye of round. So instead of it coming from the loin area and being very tender, this is going to come from the round area, and it's going to be a lot more tough. A lot of times eye of round steaks is what they turn into those cube steaks. So they run it through a tenderizer and usually turns into like country fried steak, chicken fried steak, stuff like that. So what is this cut? This is a roast. It's not a steak, but we've already seen the steak in one of the pictures. Very expensive. So this is our tenderloin roast. Yes, tenderloin roast. So in this one, it's been squared off, but just imagine this area right here is going to taper down kind of in like a point. And it's going to be attached to that bone. And so whenever I actually do demos too, where I'll sit there and like fabricate out a short loin so you can see how you can remove that tenderloin and remove that New York strip. So this is going to be your tenderloin roast, but this part is actually going to taper down. So from here to here where it's missing, is going to be what you're going to utilize for like the T-bone side. The reason it's been cut off here is because as a roast, that part has been discarded and you want to have it in its entirety, the tenderloin roast. So this looks very similar to it. The difference is with our tenderloin roast, there's no fat on it on any of the sides. On this one, you'll notice that there's a fat cap right here that's on the back side and it goes all the way back. So we've also seen this steak that it looked similar to a tenderloin steak. Do you remember what it was? Comes from the round. Eye of round roast. Yes, so this is the eye of round roast. The way you can really tell the difference if you have two of these roasts sitting there, because if you had the tenderloin, you would see that it would taper like this one does too. But this fat cap, that's right here. So this is the external portion of the carcass. It's that fat that's on it that's kind of encasing it, that subcutaneous fat. So on the tenderloin, though, it's not going to have any of it because that muscle is in between other muscles in that bone. So it's kind of enclosed inside, so it won't have any fat on it. So what do these look like? You can get this from the store. They're going to be cuts of meat that are in little cubes. They can really come from any part of the animal. There's not just one specific area. This is going to be your stew meat. Yes. What about this? It can come from any part of the animal as well. This is going to be your ground beef. Yes. So then what does make this? It's not ground beef. It's not stew meat. This one is not as common in the grocery store. Usually people will use their ground beef in this recipe. This is going to be our chili meat. So the way I tell people that ground beef is made is you've got a cut. So say you're taking your rump roast. You don't want them. You're going to turn this into ground beef. You have your rump roast. You're going to put this into a grinder. It's going to get ground twice through the grinding machine. The first time is going to be a thicker plate. So it's going to have more of a coarse ground, similar to the size of a chili meat. Now there's a chili meat plate, and then there's just the first coarse ground plate on a grinding machine, but it's going to be similar. So first time it gets ground, it's going to come out a little bit bigger and thicker like this. And then they'll take it and they'll grind it again in a thinner or a smaller plate, and it's going to have more of that like actual like familiar ground beef texture and look to it. So fun fact, it goes through the grinder twice. It starts out as a big cut, and then it'll go through once, become a coarse ground, and then another time to become a fine ground to what we are familiar with ground beef as. So what is this? Any idea? So it's going to take one of our primals. We got our 4 primals, our chuck, our rib, our loin, and our round. This is one of the primals that goes into a sub-primal. So this is actually considered a sub-primal cut. This side of it is going to be like, I mean, you can see this is so this is actually a better example. So this is our tenderloin right here, and then it goes and it tapers down. You can kind of see where it's cut off, where it's kind of got that tail. So in that roast picture, that was just right here. Now this kind of seam fat that you see right here, this just pulls right off. It's not actually attached to it. It's just a seam that's right there. So this is going to be our short loin. So whenever I do cutting demos, I usually get a short loin provided, and then we remove this tenderloin, which is right here. And then on the other side of this bone is going to be your New York strip. If you were to spin this around to see the other facing side of it, it's going to look like a ribeye on that end. So this side is going to showcase your T-bones, and then this side is going to showcase your ribeye. So this is going to be attached to the rib primal, where this is going to be more on the end of the round, if that makes sense. So what is this cut? This is one that gets removed when the carcass is still hot. So you go through your harvest process, your animal gets slaughtered, and then before it goes to age, which usually carcasses age from anywhere from between 14 and 21 days is average. That means it's just hanging in a cooler. This gets removed before the carcass gets chilled. Anybody have any idea on what it is? Most people just disregard it. It'll actually dehydrate. So if you do not pull it when the carcass is still hot, it will dehydrate, and then it just gets kind of chunked into the offal barrel. But if you do remove it, then it is called the hanging tender. Yes, good job. You got it. So yes, this is the hanging tender. So this is one very small, but it'll be removed whenever the carcass is still hot. So that is just our ID test to see kind of y'all's knowledge and what you knew about it. And then just kind of have some recognition. It's good for when you go to the grocery store to remember, oh, hey, this is what this looks like, and this is how I identify it. So custom cut, yes.
Before you move on, can you explain why the hanging tender is removed?
Because it gets dehydrated.
Okay.
So the reason is because there's no fat on the outside. So that's why you remove it hot, because if you were to chill it, then it would dehydrate out. I mean, you think of it as, and we're going to talk about like aging and dehydration as well. But if there's nothing that is insulating it, which is going to be your fat, then the longer it hangs, the more it's going to dehydrate, and the more you're not going to be able to use those lean cuts. So next is custom cut sheets. So depending on where you go, whether it's called an abattoir, if you're calling it a slaughterhouse, if you're calling it a butcher, a processor, there's lots of different names for them. Everyone is going to have their own custom cut sheet. So say you were going and you were dropping off an animal, so a cow, to get processed. Depending on the processor is what cuts they will offer or what cuts they will allow. You can always ask for any cut that you want. Say they give you a custom cut sheet and say, this is what we do. You can say, well, I would like this instead of that, and see if they're willing to do it. But it's up to the processor on if they're going to do that or not. So there's differences in processors or in slaughter facilities. So there are three main ones. There is custom exempt, there is state, and there is federally. So all of them are inspected in some sort of manner. So don't think that custom exempt is not inspected. It is. It's just different levels of inspection. So say you were to drop off a steer at your processor and they are considered custom exempt. That means when they get the product back, those individual steaks and ground beef and stuff, it is going to be labeled as not for sale. So that means they do not have an inspector on site when that animal is getting processed and when it's getting fabricated. So you cannot sell that to anybody. You need to consume that. Next is your state inspected, or with Georgia, it'd be Georgia Department of Ag, which would be the ones inspecting this one. And this is, you will get cuts back. They will be labeled. It will not be labeled as not for sale. It'll just be labeled and it'll have like that state seal on it. And these cuts, so these steaks, this ground beef, anything that's coming from it, the roasts, can only be sold within the lines of the state of Georgia. And then if you're in Alabama, they could only be sold within the lines of the state of Alabama. Federally inspected processing is going to be through USDA. They will have an inspector on site when they're getting processed and fabricated out. And these cuts, so your steaks, your ground beef, your roasts, anything that you're getting from the animal can be sold anywhere within the United States. So if you have ever purchased a beef box from like Omaha Steaks, is kind of a big name recognition one. If you've ever purchased a beef box for Omaha Steaks, they are going through a federally processed facility because they are not located in the state of Georgia. Does that make sense?
It does.
Okay. So same thing like I already said, depending on the processor is what cuts will be available. We're going to go through some cut sheets here in a second. Packaging can differ depending on where you're going from. So a lot of like the custom exempt is going to do like the butcher wrapping, whereas like your federally and state inspected are going to be more towards that like vacuum sealing packaging. Depending on how the packaging is and how it's being stored isn't really how long it can last in the freezer before it starts to get like that freezer burn to it. Vacuum packaging is definitely going to last a little bit longer than butcher wrapping, just depending on how it's stored. So different cut sheets, like I said, they all have their own. And I have two examples of different ones that are USDA inspected. Some people could have something as simple as a piece of paper and they just write down what cuts you want. That's going to be more like on your custom side, whereas your other ones may have a little bit more detailed list. So here's two examples of some cut sheets set up differently, but they have very similar cuts to them. So like on this first one, this was just ones I had pulled. This is actually one that I had used to use when I was running one of the facilities, but this is one I just pulled off the internet. So you can see they have like your flank steaks, your skirt steaks, your hanging tender. I mean, all of these, and you just check off what you want. On here, same thing. You check off what you want, and then you can list off like your thickness or your weight. So say you're wanting like 8-ounce sirloins, then you can put in saying that you want all of your sirloins to be 8-ounce. Those specifics can be kind of put into there. On these, like, so for this one that I have right here, you notice nowhere does it say oxtail on it. So that would be something that you would have to ask for specifically and see if they would do that. For oxtail, that is going to be the tail of the animal. That would be taken off, I mean, when it's still hot, because if not, then it's just going to be chunked in the offal barrel as well. But that would still, I mean, it would be aged and everything like the rest of it. But that's just going to be the tail. So it's going to have all those vertebrates on it and some of that meat that's on it as well. So just depending on where you're going, I tell people if they have questions about a cut sheet, it's easier for me to see the cut sheet that they're looking at and us kind of go through it, even if you can ask for it prior to. And some people could say, no, they're not going to offer oxtail or hanging tender because it's a little bit more labor because it's on a different time frame than the rest of the carcass to be fabricated out. Some may not offer kidney or heart or liver because they don't want to have to deal with the inspection of those organs as well. So some cuts to be aware of. We'd already kind of talked about this one. If you ask for T-bones, be prepared to not get any New York strips or tenderloins. Are those steaks still there? Yes, they're just on either side of that bone. If you ask for bone and ribeye, Be prepared to not get any back ribs back. So if you're wanting back ribs to be able to smoke or put in the crock pot, then you would want to get boneless ribeyes. So your culotte, which doesn't seem to be as popular around here as well. So your culotte, steak, or roast, if you're wanting those, then you'll be sacrificing some of your bone in sirloins because they come from that similar area. If you get a culotte steak, you'll also be sacrificing some of your sirloin tip roast or your cube steaks. And then stew meat, ground meat, and chili meat all come from trimmings, which will be the different cuts that you don't want. So like the more roast you get, the less ground beef you're going to get. The less roast you get, the more ground beef you're going to get. It's all based off of the lean that's left over after they go through and say, okay, you want your sirloins, your T-bones, your ribeyes, and your chuck roasts. But then you don't want anything else as whole cuts. You want it all ground. That's when you'll get a lot more ground beef versus if you were wanting your rump roast, your eye of round roast, your culotte, your sirloins, your short ribs, your flat irons, your blade steaks, your arm pot roast. If you want all of the cuts, you'll have a lot less ground beef coming back to you. Does that make sense before I move forward?
So on the, oh, sorry.
Well, I was looking at the chat box. So it says, is the hanging tender used for beef jerky? It can be. Most of the time, beef jerky, though, is going to be more utilized with like cuts from the round, and they'll be cut really thin, and then it has to go through and be smoked and dried down. So hanging tender is very small. I mean, if you were to dry it and not pull it when it was hot, it would dehydrate so much that you just wouldn't be able to consume it.
Got it. Thank you.
Yes. So yeah, so jerky is going to be cooked. That's the difference between like, so it is getting dried, but it's being dried by cooking, not by chilling.
Gotcha. Thank you.
All right, so now we're going to talk about quality grade and yield grade. So there are two different grading systems for beef carcasses. You've got your quality grade and your yield grade. So quality grade is going to talk about the palatability of the meat, which is going to be your tenderness, your juiciness, your flavor. There's different factors that go into evaluating it: maturity, firmness, texture, color of the lean. The main thing that people are familiar with is the distribution of marbling throughout, and we're going to talk about what marbling is here in a second. Then there's the yield grade. So this is going to be, so quality grade is talking about the fat. Yield grade is talking about the lean. So it's going to be what is the cutability of the beef. So how much lean do you have versus the fat, whereas quality is going to talk about how much fat and the distribution of the fat, if that makes sense. Okay, so quality grade, which is what most people are interested in. Yield grade, man, that's more on like the processing side than anything else. But so quality grade, there are 8 quality grades. Can anybody tell me what the highest quality grade is? What is the most expensive quality grade? So A, B, C, so grades like that, when you say grade A, B, C, that's actually gonna be your yield grades. So quality grades is gonna have names to them. So you're right. So David, it is going to be prime. So the most expensive cut you can get is a prime cut, right? There's different levels of prime. Next one down, so prime is gonna be the most expensive, the highest quality you can get. Do you know what the next one is? Starts with a C. Choice, yes. So you go from prime, then you go to choice. And then the next one, right below choice, you know what that one's called? Starts with an S. Okay. So next is going to be select. So prime, choice, and select are going to be the USDA grades that are going to be what's sold in the stores. After that, you still go more, and that's going to be like when you get into standard, when you get into commercial, when you get into utility, and when you get into cutter and canner. From standard and down, those are not going to be sold in the store. From select and up, they are. So when it has like the plus or minus, So for select, there's two different times. There's high select, low select. For choice, there's high, average, and low. For prime, there's high, average, and low. We're going to talk about that here in a second. Within all of these, there are 100 subunits. That gets more into if you're determining if your carcass is prime, choice, select, different things like that. So y'all don't necessarily have to worry about that. So what is marbling? So marbling is going to be the big thing that's going to determine what your quality grade is. It's going to be the intramuscular fats. There's intermuscular fat, which is fat that goes between the muscles, whereas intramuscular fat is going to be the fat that is within the muscle. And I'll show you that here in a second. There's different types. There's subcutaneous fat, which is going to be on the outside, in between the skin and the carcass. Your inter is going to be in between your muscles, and intra is going to be within it. So it's intermingled, and the distribution of fat within the lean is how it's determined, and it helps the degree of marbling determine what the quality grade is. So there are 9 marbling scores. Does anybody have any idea on them? Do you want me to let you guess, or do you want me to just go through them? David, do you have any idea? It's okay if you don't. No ideas. Okay. There are 9 different ones. So the first is abundant, and this is going to be the most amount of marbling that you can possibly have. So this is going to be your high prime. If it ever has the word abundant in the marbling score, it's automatically going to be prime. So your 3 are going to be your abundant, your moderately abundant, which is going to be your average prime, and then your slightly abundant, which is going to be your low prime. So 1, 2, and 3, abundant, moderately abundant, and slightly abundant are all considered prime carcasses, prime quality grades. Next are going to be our 3 choice ones. So moderate is going to be your high choice, so almost prime, but not quite. Modest is going to be your average choice. And small is going to be your low choice. So the highest that you can get and before going prime is going to be your moderate, which is going to be your high choice. Modest is average choice. Small is low choice. This is how they decide really how much that's going to cost, how much it's going to bring in retail wise. And it's all based off of the distribution of fat. And I'm going to show you all some pictures here in a second. Next is going to be for your select, and that is going to be your slight and your traces. So this is going to be even less amount of fat, and I'm going to show you some pictures here. And then the last one is called practically devoid, which means there's like hardly any marbling in there whatsoever. It's very, very hard to determine if there's anything there. Now I'm going to go into some pictures. So this is an example of an abundant ribeye. Lots of marbling. So this is going to be our marbling, all of this fat. So if you look at this is going to be where your intermuscular fat is what this is, where this is your intramuscular fat, if that makes sense. So it's in separate areas. So 10 is a lot. Yes, yes, but there is a grading to it. So in the chat says very subjective. It could be subjective to the average consumer, but it's a very objective way of looking at it. So when you think of like meat, if you think of judging, like meat judging versus livestock judging is on the live side. That's very subjective. It's based off of what my opinion is if I'm going to judge like a livestock show. Whereas meat judging, there are standards that you are trained. So like I know how to go in and determine what the quality grade is. So you are trained on it. So from outside looking in, it looks subjective, but it's not because there's so many different qualifications that it has to meet to be able to check off of that box. This is kind of the overall view of it. Whereas if you were actually trained and certified to do it, there's a lot of different steps that goes into it, a lot of different math. They even have machines now that'll go through and you can take a picture of a ribeye and it'll shoot off all of this stuff. So what is the typical breakdown of the intramuscular fat of the average animal? So there isn't an average animal. It depends a lot. It's all based off of genetics and environment are the 2 different things that help determine how much marbling is going to be there. You have to be a breed that allows for marbling to be there, high marbling, but then you have to have the environment factor that goes into producing it. So for example, We used to do this thing called pasture to packer when so I'm originally from Texas. So when I was in Texas, we had this program called pasture to packer where 4-H and FFA students would all have cattle from the same farm. And then they would decide what they were going to feed it. They would set it up with the farmer, and then they would feed it throughout the show season. And then afterwards, we would process those animals. So we had a set of, I think it was like 9 or 11 calves that had been shown throughout the season. They had been fed different feed regimens. All of them but one came back as either high choice or prime. One of them did come back as select, which didn't make that choice or higher range. And so it had a lot less fat. And I'll show you what one of those looks like. And the reasoning is because they did not feed the right nutrients that was needed. The genetics were there. It could accumulate that marbling. Just the environment did not allow for it, if that makes sense. So marbling wise, this is the highest marbling that you will have. You've got your abundant. Then you go down to your moderately abundant, still considered prime. Then you've got your slightly abundant, which is still considered prime. This is based off of the USDA quality grade standards. From there, you go down even further. So this is going to be your high choice, your moderate. Then a little bit more or less marbling is going to be your modest, which is going to be your average choice. From there, you go a little bit less, so which is going to be your small. So you can still see those specks of that marbling, that intramuscular fat, but just not as much. That's going to be your low choice. Next is slight. So there's hardly any there. I mean, you could count the flex, whereas this one, it might take you a little bit longer to count it because it goes through it. This has even less to it. There is something called the choice select spread. So there is a huge price difference between this ribeye and this ribeye. So they're going to get a lot more if they can get to that small or higher choice or prime than what they can get if they are in that select range. So this is kind of a breakdown of all of them. So you've got your prime, so high, average, and low, which is going to be your abundant, moderately abundant, slightly abundant. Then you've got your choice, high, average, and low. So your moderate, your modest, and your small. Select, you've got your slights, and that's going to be your high select and your low select. And then standard is going to be their like traces and practically devoid, but this is not what's going to be sold at the store. Anything that's sold at the store is going to be select and higher. So USDA grades, like I just said, is only going to be your prime, your choice, or your select, but there's a range within each of those. Does anybody have any questions about that before we go into the next topic? No? So over the years, there is a lot more choice carcasses because that's what people are choosing for genetic wise that are going into the food system. So a lot more choice carcasses than there is select or less. When you get into like your practically devoid, which is going to be your cutter, your canner, all of those, that's going to be more based off of the age of the animal and less on what the quality grade. So if it was, so with yield grade and age grades, you have letters. So the older the carcass is, like it could have a ton of marbling and could have been considered prime at one point in its life. But when it hits a certain age, which is showcased on a carcass on the ossification of the bone, so the harder the bone is, the older the animal is going to be. Once that ossification starts in those certain vertebrae, then it's going to bring them down and they cannot no longer go to be sold as steaks and things like that. It's going to be more some of those animals that it's going to go towards the ground meat. A lot of them are going to go towards like the fast food chain type. Or if it gets past a certain point, it'll go into like dog food and different things like that. So now people always wonder, drop off this 12,000 pound animal. Why do I not get 12,000 pounds or 12,000, sorry, 1,200. That'd be a huge animal, 12,000. You drop off this 1,200 pound animal and you not get 1,200 pounds of meat back. Why? Well, there's a lot more to the animal than just muscle, right? So there's things that get taken into consideration, like your dressing percent. So to determine the dressing percent, you're going to look at your hot carcass weight, which is going to be the hanging weight. You're going to divide it by whatever that live weight is, and then times it by 100. That's how you get your dressing percent. And we're going to talk about that more in depth here in a second. Your retail yield to determine that amount. You're going to look at your retail cut weight. So say the boxes of actual retail cuts you pick up, divide it by the carcass weight, which is this hot carcass weight right here, the hanging weight, times it by 100, and that's how you determine what the proportion of retail cuts from the carcass is. So hot carcass weight is the carcass that is hanging on the rail. So what is part of that as well is going to be the bone, is going to be the fat. So a lot of that gets discarded. So just because you have, say you have a hot carcass weight of 500 pounds, doesn't mean you're going to get 500 pounds of meat back, because some of that cannot be utilized. And then your total yield is going to be your retail cut weight based off of the live weight. This is going to be a small number because it's based off of the amount of meat weight that you're getting back in those boxes versus what that animal weighed when it was still live. So dressing percent. Average dressing percent can vary depending on the animal. Some factors that influence that is going to be the sex of the animal. Is it a cow, a steer, a bull, or a heifer? And a lot of that is based off of the organs that it's got and the way that the fat is accumulated. Next is going to be if it's forage or grain finished. So if it's grass-fed or grain-fed, not all the time, but more often than not, is going to have more fat than if it's grass-fed. The trimming that's required of it, so how much fat, external fat is on there. If there was any hide contamination, so say during the harvest process, so the slaughter process, something happened and some fecal matter got onto a part of the carcass. Well, you can't just wash that off. It's got to be cut off. So it's based off of contamination. Was there an abscess inside and it was contaminated and you had to cut out all of that? So that's based off of like the hide and just the contamination portion. The ratio of muscle to fat to bone. So you could have an animal that has a lot of bone and not a whole lot of muscle to it. And then your gut fill. So at live weight, did you just feed that animal before dropping it off at the processor? Because the live weight's going to be a lot higher, but then all of those internal organs are going to get discarded. So like your pluck area, which is going to be like your heart and your lungs and things like that. And then like your stomach, which will, all of that will just get kind of, it gets pulled out, it gets eviscerated. And so, but that's all weight that was there at that live side. And then if the animal was bred, if it was pregnant, if it had a fetus inside, that would add weight to it as well. So some numbers for dressing percent. This is a lot of math that goes into it. So for average steer, your based off live weight and hot carcass weight, you're going to average about they say between 60 and 65% for like an average steer on your dressing percent. For cull cows, it's going to range between 45 and 58. All based off of the factors that we just talked about. Bulls are going to be a little bit lower than steers, which is going to be your 60 to 62. And then grain versus forage fed is going to range from like 52 to 58, just depending on the animal. So edible yield expectations. And this is when a lot of people have a lot of questions about this stuff. Like they just, you don't understand. Why am I not getting back the amount that I think I should? So from the carcass, you can expect a finished steer or heifer to yield a grade 3, which is going to be the amount of fat that's going to be on there. And then your retail yield from that hot carcass weight is going to be about 57 to 65%. Factors that influence this are going to be muscle to fat to bone ratio, your yield grade, your cut style, is it bone in or boneless, the moisture, so the aging. So if you have an animal that does not have a whole lot of fat cover to it, very, very lean animal, when it ages, the longer it ages, the more that it's going to get dehydrated and the more compromised that lean is going to be. So we, for example, we had a guy that used to hang his carcasses for 28 days. That means it was in the cooler, hung up for 28 days. There's a lot more dehydration to that carcass than for one that was only hung for 14 days. Is there a difference in the tenderness? Yes, the longer ages, the more tender it's going to be, but you're also going to have some loss on that dehydration. So if there wasn't a whole lot of fat cover, a lot of that lean would get compromised. It would have to get cut off. the percentage in fat for ground beef, I mean so a lot of that, when you get, like you say, it's like 90-10 or 92-8 or whatever, that's all based off the amount of fat that was put into the grinder. A lot of that is based off of the quality of the animal. The higher quality, so more prime cuts, because they could even have higher quality in their roasts, not just their ribeyes that you're looking at. That would be more fat throughout their roasts. So that would bump your lean to fat ratio up, right? You're going to have more fat versus your lean whenever you're doing those ground cuts. So higher quality means more fat, depending on what your end goal is. So say you're wanting to eat very, very lean cuts of meat, like very, not a whole lot of fat cuts of meat, then you may not necessarily want the prime side. You might want something that's going to be more on the choice side because there'll be less fat distributed throughout that muscle. So the approximate percentage of cuts from an animal, which is different for every animal. This is kind of just the average. So in your chuck, you can expect about 26%. From your rib area, 9.5% of the cuts you're getting back. Short loin, 8%, sirloin, 9%. Your round, about 27% of the meat you're getting back is going to come from that area. Your brisket's going to be 6%. Your foreshank is going to be 4%. Your short plate, which is going to be where like your skirts and stuff come from, is going to be 5.5%. And your flank is going to be 4%. So that's kind of the percentage in the breakdown of where those cuts are going to come from. Now you could say all you want is ribeyes and nothing else, and then all the rest of this would be going into ground. So while we have this picture up here, this chuck area, this is going to be where your chuck is when it's broken down to those 4 parts. This is your chuck. This is your rib. This is your loin, this whole portion right here. And this is going to be your round or your rump. So depending on if you get a whole cow, a half cow, a quarter of a cow, is depending on how many of each steaks you're going to get, how much ground beef you're going to get. 1 cow is meat's cut in half, it's split, so you have 2 sides of the carcass. You usually say you can get, it depends on the thickness of your steaks, but say you get about 10 ribeyes on one side and 10 ribeyes on the other. So you have 20 ribeyes total on this carcass. And then you've got to divide that by 4 people if you're getting a quarter of an animal. So that's why you get the amount of steaks and the amount of ground beef and stuff that you get back if you are quartering out or having out an animal. All right, I threw a lot of information at y'all. What questions do we have? Or did I just blow everybody's mind?
I think we're all processing, no pun intended. But we have had some really wonderful comments in the chat about how informative this was. So we really appreciate you. I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll and pause our recording.